What do people see when they are dying? Near-death visions, NDVs, are a common phenomenon, not a hallucination or delusion, but part of a patient's life journey. This video is based entirely on public reports from the New York Times. According to statistics, about 88% of dying patients will experience near-death visions. These visions are often vivid, realistic, and related to the patient's personal experiences. They can bring comfort, peace, and joy to patients, and even help them reunite with deceased loved ones. Next, let's hear the stories of those who have experienced near-death visions. At the age of 12, Chris Cole first saw a vision of death. His memory of that summer in 1974 is hazy, but the sense of mystery he felt at his dying father's bedside remains clear. Cole spent his childhood in Toronto, where his father was a busy surgeon who didn't have much time for his son, except for their annual fishing trips together in the Canadian wilderness. That year, his 42-year-old father was emaciated and weak from cancer. He reached out to touch the buttons on Cole's shirt, fiddled with them, and said a few things about packing up and flying back to the cabin in the woods. I intuitively knew that wherever he was going, it must be a good place, because we were going fishing, Cole told me. As Cole reached out to touch his father, he felt a hand on his shoulder. The pastor who had followed him into the room told him that his father was having delusional symptoms and took him away. Early the next morning, Cole's father died. Today, Cole calls what he witnessed a near-death vision. He doesn't believe his father was delusional. His thoughts took him to the Canadian wilderness, a place where he and his son could be together. He feels that the pastor made the same mistake that many other caregivers make, assuming that the moment was out of touch with reality and that the boy needed to be protected from witnessing it. It wasn't until more than 40 years later that Cole was able to talk about what happened in the hospital room that night. He had followed in his father's and 3 generations of his ancestors' footsteps to become a medical professional, working as chief medical officer at a hospice in Buffalo, where he researched near-death visions. It wasn't until a TEDx talk in 2015 that he shared the story of his father's death. Wearing a casual jacket, he paced the stage and told the audience, "I want to say that I didn't choose the topic of death. I think it chose me, or followed me." He continued, "When I stand at the bedside of the dying, I see what I saw as a child, what I tried so hard to forget. I see dying patients reach out to their mothers, fathers, and children, calling out to them, many of whom they haven't seen in years. Yet it's remarkable how many of them seem to be at peace." The talk received millions of views and thousands of comments, many from nurses who were grateful that someone in the medical community was validating what they had known all along. Some people also commented with their own stories of witnessing loved ones having visions at the end of life. For them, Cole's message confirmed something they knew instinctively, that end-of-life visions are real and can provide comfort, even healing past trauma. In some cases, they can even be transcendent. Our brains are capable of creating all sorts of imagery to help us make sense of our lives as we die. On a Saturday morning in the spring of 1999, Cole started his first shift at a Buffalo hospice. He had a degree from Ohio State University, where he had been a doctoral student in neurobiology, but his medical training had not prepared him for this job. After an internal medicine residency, Cole had begun a cardiology fellowship in Buffalo. He took the part-time hospice job to earn extra money to support his wife and 2 young daughters. Up to that point, Cole had worked in the traditional medical system, focused on patients who were often hooked up to machines or heavily medicated. He didn't have time to listen to them if they talked about visions. But in the hushed environment of the hospice, Cole found himself encountering something he hadn't seen since his father's death. Patients talking about seeing people and places that only they could see. So, just like with my dad, I felt this sense of awe, this sense of something that I didn't understand but could certainly appreciate, he says. On one shift, Cole checked on a 70-year-old woman named Mary, whose adult children were gathered in her room, drinking wine to steady their nerves. Cole remembers Mary sitting up in bed without warning, her arms cradling an infant. "Danny," she whispered, kissing and hugging the baby only she could see. At first, her children were confused. No one in the family was named Danny, and there was no baby in their mother's arms. But they could sense that whatever their mother was experiencing was bringing her a sense of peace. Cole later learned that Mary had lost a child to stillbirth years before any of her 4 children were born. She had never spoken to her children about it. But now, it seemed, she was using a vision to come to terms with that loss. Observing Mary's final days in hospice gave Cole a sense of purpose. "I was getting disillusioned with the conveyor belt nature of medicine," Cole tells me. Hospice felt like a more humane, dignified model of care. He gave up cardiology to work full-time at the bedside of dying patients. Many of these patients described visions that were drawn from their own lives and seemed to have meaning, unlike the hallucinations or delusions, or even incoherent thinking, that can also occur at the end of life. But Cole couldn't convince other doctors of the value of these visions, even the young residents who accompanied him on his rounds at the hospice. They wanted scientific evidence. At the time, there were only a handful of published medical studies that documented end-of-life visions, and these studies mostly relied on second-hand reports from doctors and other caregivers, rather than descriptions from the patients themselves. On a plane ride home from a conference, Cole outlined a study of his own, which researcher Ann Barnes would join in 2010. Like Cole, Barnes had a family member who had experienced a vision near death. Her grandfather had imagined himself at a train station with his brothers. The study wasn't designed to answer the question of how these end-of-life visions are neurologically different from hallucinations or delusions. Cole saw his role as a chronicler of his patients' experiences. Borrowing methods from social science research, Cole, Barnes, and their colleagues conducted daily interviews with patients in a 22-bed hospice unit, hoping to capture the frequency and different themes of the visions patients reported. They screened patients to make sure they were mentally clear and not in a state of confusion or delirium. The results of the study, published in the Journal of Palliative Medicine in 2014, suggested that end-of-life visions are much more common and frequent than other researchers had found. A striking 88% of patients reported having at least one vision. Later studies in Japan, India, Sweden, and Australia would confirm the prevalence of visions, with percentages ranging from 20 to 80%. Though most of these studies relied on interviews with caregivers, not patients. Over the past decade, Cole has assembled a long-term research team and expanded his studies to include interviews with patients receiving hospice care at home and their families. This has deepened researchers' understanding of the variety and depth of these end-of-life visions. They can occur while patients are asleep or fully awake. The most common visions involve deceased family members, while visions with religious themes are extremely rare. Patients often relive important moments from their lives, including the joys of falling in love and the pain of rejection. Some dream about unfinished business in their daily lives, such as paying bills or taking care of children. Visions may also feature past or imagined journeys, whether a long road trip or a short walk to school. Patients say that whatever the subject matter, these visions feel real, unlike anything they've ever experienced before. They may begin days or even weeks before death. Crucially, the visions increase in frequency as people approach the end of life, and they become increasingly focused on deceased loved ones or pets. It is these visions that bring profound meaning and comfort to patients and their loved ones. Cole's latest research focuses on the emotional transformation he often observes in patients who have these visions. In the first of this series of studies, published in 2019, they measured psychological and spiritual growth in 2 groups of hospice patients: those who had experienced visions and a control group who had not. Patients were asked to rate how much they agreed with statements such as, "I have changed my mind about what is most important in life," or "I have a better understanding of questions about the soul." Those who had experienced end-of-life visions had higher scores on these statements, suggesting that the visions can trigger inner change even at the very end of life. "This is the most striking finding of our research," Cole tells me. "It highlights the paradox of death, that even as the body is failing, there is growth and a search for meaning. It also emphasizes what patients tell us, that they are being rekindled." In our conversations over the past year, the tension between medicine's need for evidence and the ineffable experiences of his patients has come up repeatedly. Cole first felt this tension about a year before his first study was published, when he visited a dying World War II veteran named John. John had been tormented by nightmares throughout his life, in which he was transported back to the beaches of Normandy on D-Day. John had participated in a rescue mission, ferrying wounded soldiers to England while leaving those too far away to die. The nightmares haunted him until the very end of his life, when he dreamed that he had been discharged from the army. In another dream, a fellow soldier who had been killed appeared to John and told him that his comrades would soon come for him. After that, the nightmares stopped. Since then, Cole has been haunted by the mystery of how thought can exceed what science and language can adequately capture. We are so obsessed with quantifying and giving structure to something so deeply spiritual, but really, we are just bystanders and witnesses to it all, he says. When you see a 90-year-old veteran go back 70 years and experience something you can't even begin to understand, it makes you feel very small. When Cole presents his research at conferences, nurses often nod in understanding, while doctors roll their eyes in disbelief. He has found that skeptics are often better able to understand the research after watching video recordings of patient interviews. This video, which documents Cole's early research in 2008, is perhaps most striking not for the content of the visions, but for the patient's demeanor. "There is no fear," says Cole. A teenage girl describes a dream in which she played Barbies in a castle with her deceased aunt, her face alight with joy. A dying man with cancer talks about his wife who died a few years earlier and who appears to him in dreams, always wearing blue. She waves to him and smiles. That's all. But in that moment, he seems to be transported to another time and place. Kerr often observed that those at the end of life tended to lose interest in the activities they were obsessed with in life and turned to their loved ones instead. Reasons are only speculative for Kerr. In his book, Death is But a Dream, published in 2020, he concluded that the love found by patients at the moment of death often led them to a place some people call enlightenment, and some call God. Time seems to disappear, he tells me. Those who love you, protect you, and help you grow are still there on a spiritual and psychological level. Connor O'Neill, who died at the age of just 10 in 2022, was such a case. Kerr and I visited his parents at their home. They told us that just 2 days before their son died, he had called out the name of a family friend whom he did not know had just died. "Do you know where you are?" Connor's mother asked. "Heaven," the boy replied. Connor had not spoken for several days by then, nor had he moved without help. But at that moment, he sat up on his own power and put his arms around her neck. "Mom, I love you," he said. The research conducted by Kerr found that in the final days of life, these moments help parents like the O'Neill couples and other relatives bear unbearable grief by surpassing the often painful physical decline. If it weren't for that comfort, or that gift given to us by heaven, I don't know what I would have done, Connor's father told us. It's already difficult enough. As Kerr explained, this is the difference between being wounded and being comforted. In June, I visited the adult daughter of a patient who had just died at home a few days earlier. We sat in her mother's living room, looking out at the patio and bird feeders that had brought so much joy to her mother. 3 days before her mother died, as her daughter was tidying up the room, Her mother started speaking much more clearly than before. The daughter climbed onto the mother's bed, held her hand, and listened. Her mother first spoke to the daughter's father. She could see him handsome in the corner of the room. Then she started speaking to her second husband. Even while retelling the story, this moment feels sacred. "I will never forget it," the daughter tells me. "It was just beautiful. I also met Peggy Harlowski, a patient of Barna's, who had just started home hospice care in her home days earlier. Prior to that, a cancer hospital in Buffalo found clots all over her body indicating that her year-long treatment was no longer working. It was time for her to stay home comfortably with her husband Stephen and 2 Italian greyhounds. Stephen led Barna and me to the family room, where Peggy lay on the couch. Barna knelt on the floor, checked the patient's catheter, and reduced the dosage of her prescription so that she would have to swallow fewer pills every day. She also prescribed an analgesic cream for her tailbone pain and inquired about her hallucinations. The weekend on-call nurse had seen Peggy speaking to her deceased mother. "She was just standing there," Peggy said to Barna, pointing to a corner of the room. "Was that the only time you saw her?" Barna asked. "So far, yes. Do you think you'll see her again?" "Considering what's happening right now, I suppose I will." Peggy sank deep into the couch, closed her eyes, and remembered another instance of seeing the deceased, her first Italian greyhound she and Stephen had adopted. "I'm good with everyone. I'm happy," she said. "It's not the time yet. I know it's not yet, but it's coming soon." In 2018, as my mother Chloe Zivik was on her deathbed, I had not yet heard of near-death visions. When her caregiver told me that she was experiencing what we then called illusions, I acted purely on intuition. My mom, at 95 years, was receiving end-of-life care at home in the Hudson Valley. She suffered from lung disease and congestive heart failure and was nearly bedridden. The end-of-life doctor prescribed her opioids and had her take antipsychotic and anti-anxiety medication to control the so-called hallucinations, which he feared would interfere with her sleep. The illusions of my mother could very well have been the result of some of these medications, but as CARE explains, natural hallucinations are not ruled out from drug-induced hallucinations. They can coexist. For my mother, I have always understood that her imaginary world deserves respect. I do know what drug-induced hallucinations look like and feel. Approximately 10 years before she died, my mother accidentally hurt her spine. The doctors at the local hospital prescribed her opioids to manage pain, which seemed to turn her into a different person. She saw spiders crawling across the hospital walls. She confused a patient's bed with a subway platform. Worse, she denied my love for her, declaring I had never loved her. Once her medication stopped, these illusions disappeared. The hallucinations at the end of her life were a wholly different matter. These hallucinations were closely related to her lengthy life and brought her deep comfort and joy. "Did you know this is the first time in my life that I have no worries?" she told me. I recall feeling relieved at the time. After more than a decade of health decline, she seemed to have found tranquility finally. The day before she died, when her breathing was increasingly difficult, Mom shared the news. "I have a new guide." "Who?" I asked. "Mark. He'll take me across," she replied. She was referring to my husband, who was alive and well at home in North Carolina. "That's great, Mom, but I need him here with me too," I said. "Do you think he can do both?" "Oh, no problem. He's quite capable," she assured. That night, as Mom's breathing became increasingly difficult, she murmured, "I'm thinking about the afterlife." She was contemplating my husband, who would guide her there. The nurse on duty that night and I sat by her bedside, watching Mom's oxygen levels drop from 68 to 63, then to 52, until she passed away the next morning. My mother was not a brave person in the traditional sense. She was afraid of snakes, subway platforms, and any pain. But she confronted death with the conviction that a man who loves her daughter dearly would lead her path. "Do you think this will happen to you?" she asked me once when we referred to her hallucinations. Perhaps it's in the genes, I said, not knowing then that these experiences were something any of us could likely encounter. From the above cases, we speculate that the possible reasons for near-death visions include two factors. One possibility is a natural brain response. Terminal hallucination could be a natural response of the brain in the process of dying. When brain function begins to decline, it may produce some abnormal electrical signals, leading to the emergence of hallucinations. The other possibility is psychological factors. Terminal hallucinations reflect the psychological factors of patients. For example, patients may wish to be reunited with deceased loved ones or seek to find the meaning of life. In summary, terminal hallucinations can help patients face death more suitably. They can let patients look back at their whole lives and find the meaning of life. Moreover, they can provide a transcending experience beyond physical death, helping to alleviate the fear and anxiety of dying in patients. Therefore, terminal hallucinations are not an illusion or delusion, but an integral part of a patient's life journey. We should respect and understand our patients' experiences and provide them with necessary support and help. If you found it helpful, please like and share it for the benefit of more people.